Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back to another weekly conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Kao Kalia Yang. Kao is the author of both adult and children's literature. Her adult memoirs include The Late Homecomer, The Song Poet, and Somewhere in the Unknown World. Her children's books include A Map into the World, The Shared Room, and Caged, a stunning picture book illustrated by Khou Vue, and a book we've talked about here previously on the podcast. Today, we're diving into her newest middle grade debut, The Diamond Explorer, a book that captures a Hmong American boy's struggle to find a place for himself in America and in the world of his ancestors. I can't wait to talk to Kao for a second time, so let's get right to it. Kao, welcome to the KidLit Love podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie. It's wonderful to return.
Well, I remember at the end of our first episode, you mentioning a middle grade novel was on the horizon. And so I'm honored and grateful to be able to talk to you about it today and have a repeat guest on the podcast.
I'm so happy to be here.
So before we jump in and talk about your newest book, I would love for you to just talk a little bit about you, of course, and your writing. We have adult books, picture books, now middle grade novels. Tell us about your journey to all of these places and books.
I've always loved stories, Stephanie. I was born in a refugee camp. For the first 6 years of my life, I didn't go to school because I couldn't. The schools are too crowded. I spent my time at the feet of my elders, and they would tell me stories that exploded the possibilities within the camp. I meet creatures like the tiger, the fierce tiger, um, that of course was absent from my world. I didn't have books, I didn't have TVs, and so it was through these stories that my world was able to grow. So
Mhm.
I've always been a lover of stories. And then, of course, when we came to America as refugees of war, my family, we were low income. We lived in the housing projects. There was a bookmobile that came up to the projects every week. And my older sister and I, we would check out these books. And before we could read, she would use the images and create incredible stories for me. I called her the human VCR. Really wanted a VCR, so she was our human VCR. And then once she started reading, and then I started reading, that love of stories just grew from there. So in many ways, while I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be a writer, like so many children of immigrants and refugees, we were taught that we needed doctors and lawyers to survive. You know, doctors heal what is broken in the human body. Lawyers protect the rights that we've never had enough of. I didn't think I was going to be a writer, but it is exactly what I became, and that was not a surprise to my mother, who said, of course you would." Um, and so I became a writer first for adults because as a woman and as a woman of color from an impoverished background, I knew that I needed to gain a kind of legitimacy in the field, a kind of credibility that had to be earned. And so I became an adult writer. I've always loved children's books, so the fact that I would grow there has never been a surprise to me. It took time, and I'm glad it did because I became a mother in that process. So I have three kids, identical twin boys who are presently still 8, and a daughter who is still 10. At the end of the month, this changes. Um, but for now, that's what they are, and that is what I am.
Wow. Yeah. So doctors, lawyers, but I would say that writers, they're the keeper of the stories. They're the teller of the stories that are just as important, if not more, in my very, special reader's heart.
Oh, I'm in complete agreement. I say to my parents that what I want to do with words is no different than what I would have done with medicine. I want to use them to heal.
Yes. That is, oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that is exactly what books do, I think, for readers. But I also have a special bias to your books because we've been able to talk about them on the podcast. And I feel like there is so much in your newest middle grade novel, The Diamond Explorer, um, that can do just that for so many readers on so many different levels. The amount that I wrote in response to your book, whether I was collecting quotes or jotting down my own memories, my own questions about my family, my own reactions, my own everything. I ended up pouring lots of myself onto the page as I read your words through Malcolm. Beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you. Again, you're one of the first conversations that I have had about diamonds, so I will be have had so far. So I'm delighted to hear this.
Yeah. So, why don't we give listeners a sneak peek? Because when this episode is airing, your book is almost here. It is just about ready to go. So, I would love for you to tell listeners a little bit about what the book is about, and also the inspiration behind why this for your first middle grade novel.
So I will start by saying that I've been visiting a lot of middle schools from the beginning of my career. Before I even adventure into children's, a lot of middle schoolers are reading The Diamond Explorer or, excuse me, The Late Homecomer. And so I was visiting, but the question has always been, when are you going to write for us?
Yeah.
And so finally, I am happy to tell the middle schoolers that I'm writing this for you. And their ask at the very beginning, Stephanie, was that I wrote a book that would scare them, a scary book. And so I've always known this about myself as a writer, but for me to scare my readers, I have to scare myself first. So I had to be ready to go into a scary space for me to do the work of the Diamond Explorer. But I'm a person inspired by the beautiful things in life, by the wind blowing through the grass, by the sun filtering through the leaves. And so I had to put myself and get myself into a space of being much younger than I am now, of course. Malcolm is 11. I remember being 11, living in a world where so many people around me they felt they knew my story. My teachers, my parents, my siblings, they felt they knew who I was and where I belonged, but I did not. And I remember being uncertain of so many of the big questions and the small questions of my life. And so that is who Malcolm is. Malcolm is 11. Malcolm is surrounded by people, and everybody thinks they know Malcolm's story. But how can they when Malcolm himself has no idea? The book is very much about meeting yourself in ways that I could have pictured from the onset. I didn't know that in the Diamond Explorer, I would try to answer some of the big questions of my life. What happens when we die? Do we get to meet the people who die before us? Like, how do we construct this kind of worldview? Um, Malcolm is destined to become a great shaman, but Malcolm has no idea.
Yeah.
Malcolm is a Hmong boy growing up on the Minnesota prairie, a Hmong boy who initially speaks with a very thick accent because his parents speak Hmong to him all the time. Malcolm moves into the house of his sister because of racism and other
Mhm.
misunderstandings. And Malcolm, his Hmong stops growing. His English, of course, grows by leaps and bounds, and he loses his accents, but his Hmong stops growing. And the seed of this inspiration is a boy I love dearly, my baby brother, who once went on a search to become a diamond explorer. And so that reality of Max in our driveway looking for diamonds to help us pay for college has always stayed with me. And I was looking for a way to translate that into the realm of middle grade fiction. And suddenly, with the Diamond Explorer, I could do so. Adventure from myself, from this kid who inspires me to search for beauty in the world, and then make it as scary as our world can be.
Oh, I just got chills knowing that that Diamond Explorer concept and that part you're talking about was such a powerful part in the book without spoiling things for readers to know that that was based on something so personal just makes it that much more powerful. Oh.
Very much so.
Now, the format, I would love to talk to you a little bit about the format of the book, which really, in my mind, contributes so much to how we get to know Malcolm and all of the moving parts that kind of swirl around Malcolm. So we start out with this beautiful prologue about Malcolm, and I read this opening more than once just to read it and absorb it and picture it and feel the grass and the wind and see it. The words are just beautiful. But it opens with Malcolm, but then it shifts to the perspectives of everyone around Malcolm, right? His teachers, his parents, even his siblings. And so we start to get a picture of Malcolm, but then we get the real picture in the next section where we actually hear from Malcolm and we see who he really is, what he's trying to be, what he's trying to figure out. And then we get to come back around where we meet his ancestors and get an even bigger, more expansive picture. And then it comes back to Malcolm again. I just loved the format to get all of these different views. Like, I feel like we got a 360-degree look at Malcolm as a reader is trying to figure out who he is. And I'm wondering about that format. What made you choose that? Did it choose you, perhaps in the writing? I'm just really curious because it was a powerful part for me.
The prologue just came.
Mm,
I went to my computer, the prologue was just there, right there. And then I think because of the nature of Malcolm, and the realm of fiction is very different from nonfiction because of who Malcolm is. For me to begin to understand Malcolm, I had to move from the outside in, which I think is so true of our experiences of children in our society, of 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And so I moved closer and closer and closer to the heart of this kid.
mm,
Um,
yeah,
and that just felt right. I wanted to do Malcolm that justice. And in many ways, Malcolm was holding me at bay at different points of the writing. I should say, Stephanie, that as an author who's written, for adults and children across genre lines and for a multitude of audiences, this book has taken the longest of any of my books to write.
it did.
Did. It took me, we began the project, I believe, in 2019, 2018.
Wow.
It started me and Andrew Carr, who I think is one of the most exciting editors working in the literary landscape at the moment. One of the most courageous in terms of letting your writers do they can do on the page, what they feel compelled to do on the page. Um, and so I had to write around Malcolm before I could get to Malcolm. And
Yeah.
I think that is so true of the psychology of children's literature. You know, we're writing for children, but we're writing from the outside in, so many of us. And I think this has to do with readers as well, for the most part. But it's a brave move because in middle grade novels that I've read, usually you begin with a kid and the kid takes you through.
Right.
And so I know it's a departure from the norm, but you're like a dream reader, Stephanie. You really are. You're open to anything and you trust your writers, and that is such a gift to
Yeah.
be writing for such readers. And so it felt natural for me to begin to see Malcolm in these ways and then to meet Malcolm because the story is going to be about Malcolm meeting himself.
Mhm.
And so we're moving closer and closer and closer to the center. That structure just felt right.
Yeah. Well, it certainly felt right as a reader as well, and I thank you for that lovely compliment that you paid me as a reader. I do have this, I think, really wonderful connection with books where I just expect them to move me. I expect them to have something that they need to tell me, that they need to teach me, that the author is trying to get across for me. I've always felt that way since I was little. And so I think that's why the structure, how it's put together, the nature of it just fascinates me because these choices that you make have a direct impact on what I think about the story and how I feel. And then I think also, even more importantly, is what I do next, right? How does it change you as a reader? How do you think differently? Perhaps how do you act differently? Um, and so thank you for giving me the inside scoop into that. I love your explanation of just getting closer and closer to the heart of Malcolm because that is the journey you took us on from beginning to end.
I think that's important for Malcolm's story, that we learn that we give him an opportunity to trust us first too.
Mm, yes. Yes. One of the things that I kept thinking about as I read, and as I mentioned, I would read and then I would reread, and then I would go back and I would reread again. I have written more, as I said, from this book, and I have some quotes that really jumped out at me that I would love to share after. But this one kind of idea kept coming back to me as I read, and it took me a while to think about why or how to explain it, but it was like these two competing thoughts that I was having that there is so much beauty in this book, so much beauty in the language and how Malcolm sees people and sees the world and is trying to figure things out. And there's such beauty in knowing and knowing Malcolm and knowing who he is and who he is trying to be. But then in the other side, I started to realize throughout the book that there's so much beauty in not knowing too, because there was so much that I was trying to understand alongside Malcolm and figuring out the changes in the structure from the people who were here in front of me versus the ancestors who were giving their perspectives. And I just kept coming back to that idea of beauty, but beauty in knowing and also beauty in not knowing. And for that to come through in a middle grade book so beautifully, I loved it. That's the piece I'm taking away, that I have beauty in knowing and beauty in not knowing too as a result of getting to know Malcolm.
Thank you. That's, I was I mean, it's the story of my life, right? I wanted to know so much about the future.
Mm,
At the same time, there was so much about my past that I just didn't know, couldn't know. Um, and it's always made me, uh, it's taught me how to live in a world where I anticipate without expecting, if that makes sense. But
does.
I remember meeting one of my mentors, Retta Turner, who's an African American woman from the South who'd come up here to work for a while. And she said to me, "Isn't it so lovely to be so young, to wake up and not know who you're going to be waking up beside for the rest of your life, for anything still to be possible?" And I think that is so true, you know? There's so much beauty in that not knowing.
Mhm.
Mhm. Who you're gonna be, who you're gonna sit beside, who you're gonna be speaking opposite. What a gift, how that we get to be explorers and adventurers on this journey.
Yeah.
That's the Diamond Explorer part of it.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
I'd love to share a quote or two that really jumped out at me if that's okay with you.
Please.
And this first one, I felt a connection to Caged, the previous picture book that we talked about on the podcast. And this was Malcolm's father saying this to him. And I read it over and over and over again. And here it is. Every human being has a little bit of power over their destiny, no matter how small and weak they feel. That piece of hope, that something that that you can hang on to. I just loved that because sometimes that not knowing doesn't feel good, or sometimes you don't feel that you have that control. This is such a beautiful reminder that there's always something we can grasp from the inside.
It's so true. And I think so true of being young in the world. Sometimes you feel so powerless. Um, and I guess being old too, all of it. Sometimes we feel so powerless. So that reminder I think is has been so important for Malcolm, but also for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the gift of children's literature. It is for children, but it is
Yes.
every adult with an inner child still in there somewhere that needs this and needs to heal just as much.
Yes.
Another powerful one that jumped out at me um, was this: all we can do is barter. All we can do is hope. All we can do is believe that one human being's effort to take care of another will do some good for their heart, mind, and spirit. This idea of all of us being connected and our actions influencing others in ways that we might know or we might not know, but that ultimately come back to us. Oh, I
Yes.
just,
Oh, I love these quotes that you're picking up, Stephanie.
well, you wrote them.
And sometimes I don't know where they come from.
Right. I think this book, while middle grade readers will love it, adult readers will truly love it. I think it will likely have a special place in the heart of educators and librarians because there are many chapters of the book that come from the perspective of Malcolm's teachers. And some of those teachers are welcoming and inviting, and some of those teachers are not. And to me, this book reminded me of the power as educators that we have to help kids feel seen, feel loved, feel needed, but also their families to feel seen and to feel needed and welcomed. Um, so I imagine when you go to those school visits, your middle school students will be happy that there is a book for them. But I'm imagining such a powerful connection from the educators and the caregivers of children out there as well.
I hope so. I hope so, Stephanie. I The book deals with a lot. It does not shy away from the hardness of life and our world, questions of mortality, but also our brutality to each other.
Yeah.
So in that way, I think the book is very, very bold. And I say this as a writer who I don't, as a human being who does not see themselves as bold. Even I
Right.
don't. But the book is really bold, and I hope that is so true. I think it has so much for everyone. Is the truth about Diamond. I learned so much about oh the hu- the humility of being human, Stephanie. How we want to solve each other's problems and we want to help each other, but in the end, in the end, we are creatures of our own experiences, our own truths, not
I
necessarily each other's.
Right. And that was a part that jumped out at me as well. There is a beautiful ending of the book, the author's note from you, and you have a message to the children reading the book about their stories. And you also have a message to the adults who love those children who are reading the stories. And this line, this line is on a post-it note because I know I'm going to return to it and write to it, but it said, may we be kind to ourselves, understand that the strength of our love is not limited by our range of experiences and understanding, but its ability to expand where the young take us. That was beautiful.
Thank you. I think it's so true.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think that's why I love being around young people so much as an educator, as someone who loves to clearly read books and connect them with students, but children just have so much to teach us if
Yes.
if we let them.
Yes. And if we're honest to them about our own limitations.
Yes. I've learned a lot about that in motherhood.
Same, same. Yes. Mhm.
So as you think about kind of returning to those middle school students and being able to share this book with them, what is your hope that readers will walk away with as a result of reading this book?
It goes back to the title and that story of that boy on the driveway looking for diamonds in the hopes of helping to pay for his older siblings' education. I think so often as adults, as humans, we love to point to the beauty of the world around us. We struggle to find it in ourselves. And I really hope that readers who come to this book, that they leave it with an understanding that there's a world within that is beautiful and that is dangerous and that is so rich in possibility, and that it will be an invitation for them to travel and adventure within as much as without, because these things are necessary if we're going to be whole, if we're going to continue the stories of those who've come before, if we're going to live up to the rich potential within each of us
Mm.
and all of us as a community, that interconnectedness that I can't seem to move away from in my world or the worlds that I create on the page, Stephanie.
I'm glad you don't.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one more quote that I would love to share as we wrap up the episode, because I think it so beautifully captured something in the book, but also so beautifully captures a sentiment that I would like to share back to you. And it's this: words flowed from Malcolm, and I was grateful to be caught up in their current. And I feel like that's the same thing I want to say back to you. The words that flow from you in the books that I have read, in Caged, in this book especially, I'm just so grateful to be able to read them and experience them and share them with as many listeners as I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. It is such an honor to be in conversation with you about this book that has so much of my heart tied into it. It's going to be in the world soon. It'll be my last release of the year, and has been a four-book release year for me.
Wow.
And I can just feel like my shaking heart steadying
Yeah.
with your careful, generous reading of The Diamond Explorer. Thank you.
You are most welcome. For listeners that want to find you online and learn more about you and the other books that we haven't taken a deep dive into, what's the best place for them to find you, whether website or social media or anywhere else you'd like to share?
www.kaokaliayang.com.
And I will make sure to put that into the show notes, as well as links to the Diamond Explorer, links back to Caged as well, and some of the other books that we mentioned at the top of the episode. Thank you so much for returning. I've loved this conversation even more than the first. If I didn't think that was possible, I'm just so grateful to be part of you bringing this book into the world.
Stephanie, it's such an honor to share in this world with incredible readers like you. So thank you.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of KidLit Love. Thanks for listening.